Hello YouTube! Now the video you're about to see actually aired originally as part of the Oz Armour Fest livestream in cooperation with the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum. Now if you've never heard of it, think Bovington but down under, and with, at least in my opinion, some better exhibits, but shh. They've just finished a restoration of a Tiger, which I believe is now in running operation, which is astonishing. But they did a 3-day live stream event for everybody who wasn't able to make it to Oz Armour Fest. So they asked me if I'd like to do something for that event, and I said yes. Now it had to be trimmed quite a bit in order to fit with the live stream stuff, but here it is in its original and unedited form. So it does have a slightly different format to an ordinary how I paint things, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. And for completion's sake, here it is, the Australian Sentinel AC1. Hello and welcome to a very special edition of How I Paint Things. Now I'm Troy, you might know me as Sonic Sledgehammer over on YouTube, where I do these painting guides pretty regularly. And the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum got in touch and they asked if I'd like to do something special for this live stream. And I jumped at the chance because, oh boy, what a lot of fun this would be. Now I decided to paint up the Sentinel AC1, which is far from a paper panzer. There were actually 65 of these produced, though they never saw combat. But if you're playing bolt action and you like unusual vehicles, might I suggest taking one of these as a replacement for something like an M5 Stuart in your army? Its capabilities were fairly similar, and you can look more of that up yourselves if you do care to know the technical specifications. What we're going to get started on is how to paint your own for your own army. So to begin with, here is our Sentinel. Now this is from Eureka Miniatures, which, conveniently enough for you guys down there, is an Australian company. This one's come quite a distance, all the way to Germany to be painted by a New Zealander, so it's got kind of a story behind it, this one. Now a resin kit, the turret and the hull itself are both resin, and you'll see that under there, whereas the tracks themselves are metal. What I've done, and why this one is grey on one side, I've hit it with a spray of automotive primer. Get yourself some thin grey filler primer, and then any areas where it was a little bit rough, I've gone over it with a wee bit of very fine grit sandpaper. You can use emery boards or anything of the like, something that'll just sand that down so that you get a slightly better surface to work with. What I'm going to do now is take this sucker outside. I'm going to hit it with a primer spray of Russian Uniform from Vallejo. Now, theoretically, you can use pretty much any green. We are, after all, making this one up, but Russian green is a pretty good base for all British and Commonwealth armour. So, out we go. Let's get this green. Now, once that's primed, that already looks a lot more reasonable. So why green like this? Basically, I'm going to sort of copy the Matildas and the Stuarts that were sent off in service with the Australian divisions in New Guinea and around the Pacific. So this is kind of ideal. From here, you could also add the light brown sort of camo marks, but we're going to skip that for today. Keep it nice and simple. What we need to do is mix up our highlight. So I've got here Vallejo Russian Uniform from the pot, and I'm going to go, 6 drops of that, and then some dark sand. I'm going to do 2 drops of that. Now with an old brush, I'm going to mix that together on my palette here. And then to apply it, I'm actually going to use a makeup brush. These are really useful because the soft bristles sort of stop you from pushing down too hard, and they allow you to modulate the color quite effectively. So I'll get just a wee bit of this in the tip of my bristles, and then really work it in there on a bit of kitchen towel. We'll pop the turret aside for now, and then very lightly along any edges, we're going to drag this mix of color. And you'll see we quite quickly start picking out edges of detail. Now you can repeat this over the same place a little while to sort of strengthen that color. But what I'm going to do now is go around the whole tank, and I'm going to pick out some of the edges just to give this a bit of depth. Now you'll see that's actually quite a subtle effect, and that's going to look really good if you're using that makeup brush because you get a cool transition and modulation of color even across these flat panels without having to bust out the airbrush. Now we'll move on because we do want to add a little bit more shading to this, so I'll pop the turret off, and remember of course that you do have the turret, so don't do as I do and forget to paint it. We'll put that aside. And then over the entire miniature, we're going to apply a shade of Agrax Earthshade. Now you can use any acrylic shade you like here. Something like the Army Painter's Strong Tone, or even one of the Vallejo colors will work fairly well for this. But all we're going to do is just start splodging this on. Any areas like this where you get big tide marks on flat areas, you can move it around while it's still wet and prevent it drying that way. But in your corners and such, it's not going to matter too much. What we'll do now is go around the whole tank. I do recommend do the top part first, and then once that's dried thoroughly, it's going to take about half an hour. You can come back and do the track sections. Now, after about 40 minutes to dry, this is what you're going to have. And you'll see it ties together all of those colors and gives you some nice deep shading around all of the recessed areas of detail. With resin stuff, ordinarily you'll find that shades will pick up any imperfections in the casting, but don't worry too much about that because we're going to do plenty to this that will basically hide anything like that. For now, we're going to move back to our dry brush again. Now this time, instead of a 6:2 mix, I've used a 6:3 to get a slightly brighter green. And if you want to be let in on a little secret, you could just use Nurgling Green from Citadel for this. It's a pretty close match. What I'm going to do this time is, using still my dry brush, we're going to use a slightly smaller one because I want a little more control over where this goes. So just concentrating more towards edges and any bits of detail that I really want to pick out. So hatches and similar are a pretty good candidate for this. And with that final dry brush, we've got some neat modulation of color, and finally our green is finished. So what I'm going to do, once again, turret to the side, and we're going to paint the tracks. For this, I'm using German grey. Now this is quite a dark grey, almost black. It's got kind of a rubbery finish to it when it dries. So we're going to paint in all of the tracks. Don't worry if you hit the edges. We are going to dry brush those a little silver later. But over the whole thing, you'll find that it covers a little bit easier than trying to pick out individual track links. Nice square brush for this is pretty good. And this step should not take too long. Just try and avoid any areas where you've finished the green. Now once that's dried, using the flat side of your brush, you can run on just a little bit of oily steel, or really any sort of gunmetal color here. Does not matter too much. You want to concentrate towards the edges of the track links, and some of the teeth as well. Now once that oily steel has been applied, it's time to start sticking on your decals. Now I'm using the Matilda as a basis for where these would have been applied on our Sentinel. These are from the Rubicon Models Commonwealth generic set, but there's also Company B is another company which will do these sorts of decals. Let's just get in there and put these on. Now for me, when those transfers go on is really when it starts to come together and starts looking a little more lived in. Now we've put the transfers on before we do any weathering because we want the weathering to touch the decals as well. If you put them on afterwards, they're going to look a little too fresh and it will be a bit weird. What I've got here, this is a little bit of packing foam, and I've just folded it over a couple of times, and I'm going to dab on some German camo black brown, which is quite a mouthful. But anywhere that I want just little dings on the armor, I can quite lightly tap this, and then you get this cool ragged effect with just a little bit of chipping towards the edges of areas, which is cool as. Now I recommend concentrate on areas which are likely to have been dinged around a bit, so something going through the underbrush here, areas where the crew are likely to have climbed up to get into the tank, so along the engine bay here I'm going to put a few little dips. But you can put on as much or as little of this as you like. I do suggest don't go crazy with it at first, because you'll find it is very easy to put too much of this on. But once you're satisfied with it, you can move on to the next stage. Now in reality, I've probably put too much of that on, but remember that we are painting for the tabletop, which means we want to exaggerate some details to make them stand out at gaming distance. Now on that subject, I've got here some Vallejo red leather that I have watered down until it's more like the Agrax Earthshade we used earlier. And with this, I'm going to paint in just a few little areas where I want rust to have collected. Now this will appear fairly orange going on, but as it dries, it's going to give us a neat, slightly faded rust effect. So at this stage, we're really just using this to add a little bit of color to some areas of the vehicle. We'll get away with this, I think, on our Sentinel because New Guinea and the Pacific campaign being a bit more humid by comparison than Northwest Europe, we can add as much of this as we might like. Now once that's dried, you'll see that that's way more subtle than it looks going on. And I do recommend, if you're doing this for the first time, to use more water, because you can always add another layer of that if you want to strengthen the color, but if your mix is too thick towards the paint, it's going to be quite difficult to then correct that. But let's, in the same vein, make our track wash. And for this I've used brown sand, this is still Vallejo, and a ton of water. And we're going to do pretty much the same thing, just smearing this all over the tracks. Don't worry if you do end up getting some on the tank, because of course dust travels. But we're going to do the same thing, really work it into all the recesses. We want that caked on, dusty appearance. So make sure too that you are applying a little of this near the front, up on the mudguards and what have you. So you'll see that once that dries, just like our rust, we get a much more subtle effect than it would look from what we're putting on. And that works really well as a track wash. There are some great products from Vallejo. They actually do a European and what have you mud and sand, which you can just apply straight from the pot. But if you're not scared of a little bit of mixing, just water and paint will do the job too. Now all that remains is to take this sucker outside. I'm going to hit it with a matte varnish because you want to protect your hard work. So let's come back in a couple of minutes once that's varnished and dried. And then once that varnish dries, our Sentinel is complete. And this has been a real joy to paint. It's an absolutely fascinating vehicle, and I thoroughly suggest go look up a little bit more on it because its history is just neat. Though it never saw combat, it is a fascinating design, and I think it really could have done something amazing if it was ever deployed. So thank you again to the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum for sponsoring this video. This was a lot of fun, and remember that you can pick up your own Sentinel in World of Tanks. So go check that one out if you want to cane around in some homegrown Aussie armour. Thank you very much for your time, one and all. You guys all enjoy the rest of the stream.